It was Jonathan Swift who said, "It is the talent of human nature to run from one extreme to the other." Hello, this is Nelson Olmsted. This is James Thurber Week on our short story program. And today, I'd like to tell you another chapter from Thurber's wonderful book, My Life and Hard Times. It is entitled The Car We Had to Push, and it also includes just a bit about the night the ghost got in. Many autobiographers, among them Lincoln Steffens and Gertrude Atherton, describe earthquakes their families have been in. I am unable to do this because my family was never in an earthquake, but we went through a number of things in Columbus, Ohio that were a great deal like earthquakes. I remember in particular some of the repercussions of an old Rio we had that wouldn't go unless you pushed it for quite a way and suddenly let your clutch out. Once, we'd been able to start the engine easily by cranking it, but we'd had the car for so many years that finally it wouldn't go unless you pushed it and let your clutch out. Of course, it took more than one person to do this. It took sometimes as many as 5 or 6, depending on the grade of roadway and conditions underfoot. The car was unusual in that the clutch and brake were on the same pedal, making it quite easy to stall the engine after it got started, so that the car would have to be pushed again. And the only car I was really interested in was one that the get-ready men, as we called them, rode around town in. A big red devil with a door on the back. The get-ready man was a lank, unkempt, elderly gentleman with wild eyes and a deep voice who used to go about shouting at people through a megaphone to prepare for the end of the world. He would bellow, "Get ready! Get ready! The world is coming to an end!" His startling exhortations would come up like summer thunder at the most unexpected times and the most surprising places. I remember once during Mantell's production of King Lear at the Colonial Theater that the get-ready man added his bawlings to the squealings of Edgar and the ranting of the king and the mouthing of the fool, rising from somewhere in the balcony to join in. The theater was in absolute darkness, and there were rumblings of thunder and flashes of lightning off stage. Neither Father nor I, who were there, ever completely got over the scene. In between each speech of the actors on the stage, the get-ready man, somewhere in the audience, would shout, "Get ready! The world is coming to an end!" Well, they found him finally and ejected him, still shouting. The theater, in our time, has known few such moments. But to get back to the automobile, one of my happiest memories of it was when, in its 8th year, my brother Roy got together a great many articles from the kitchen, placed them in a square of canvas, and swung this under the car with a string attached to it, so that, at a twitch, the canvas would give way, and the steel and tin things would clatter to the street. This was a little scheme of Roy's to frighten Father, who had always expected the car might explode. It worked perfectly. Roy twitched the string in the middle of a lovely afternoon on Bryden Road near 18th Street. Father had closed his eyes and, with his hat off, was enjoying a cool breeze. The clatter on the asphalt was tremendously effective. Knives, forks, can openers, pie pans, pot lids, biscuit cutters, ladles, egg beaters fell beautifully together in a lingering clamant crash. "Stop the car!" shouted Father. "I can't," Roy said. "The engine fell out." Well, it ended unhappily, of course, because we finally had to drive back and pick up the stuff. And even Father knew the difference between the works of an automobile and the equipment of a pantry. My mother wouldn't have known, however, nor her mother. My mother, for instance, thought, or rather knew, that it was dangerous to drive an automobile without gasoline. It fried the valves or something. "Now, don't you dare drive all over town without gasoline," she would say to us when we started off. Gasoline, oil, and water were much the same to her, a fact that made her life both confusing and perilous. Her greatest dread, however, was the Victrola. We had a very early one, back in the Come Josephine and my flying machine days. She had an idea that the Victrola might blow up. It alarmed her rather than reassured her to explain that the phonograph was run neither by gasoline nor by electricity. She could only suppose that it was propelled by some newfangled and untested apparatus which was likely to let go at any minute, making us all the victims and martyrs of the wild-eyed Edison's dangerous experiments. The telephone she was comparatively at peace with, except, of course, during storms, when, for some reason or other, she always took the receiver off the hook and let it hang. She came naturally by her confused and groundless fears, for her own mother lived the latter years of her life in the horrible suspicion that electricity was dripping invisibly all over the house. It leaked, she contended, out of the empty sockets in the walls if the wall switch had been left on. She would go around screwing in bulbs, and if they lighted up, she would hastily and fearfully turn off the wall switch and go back to her book, happy in the satisfaction that she had stopped not only a costly but a dangerous leakage. Nothing could ever clear this up for her. Well, our poor old Rio came to a horrible end finally. He got hit by a streetcar. I think some of us broke down and wept. And it must have been the weeping that caused Grandfather to take on so terribly. Time was all mixed up in his mind. Automobiles and the like he never remembered having seen. He apparently gathered from the talk and excitement and weeping that somebody had died. Nor did he let go of this delusion. He insisted, in fact, after almost a week in which we strove mightily to divert him, that it was a sin and a shame and a disgrace to the family to put off the funeral any longer. Now, nobody is dead. The automobile is smashed, shouted my father, trying for the 30th time to explain the situation to the old man. Well, was he drunk? Demanded Grandfather sternly. Was who drunk? Zenas, said Grandfather. He had a name for the corpse now. It was his brother Zenas, who, as it happened, was dead, but not from driving an automobile while intoxicated. Zenas had died in 1866. A sensitive, rather poetical boy of 21 when the Civil War broke out, Zenas had gone to South America, just, as he wrote back, until it blows over. Returning after the war had blown over, he caught the same disease that was killing off the chestnut trees in those years and passed away. It was the only case in history where a tree doctor had to be called in to spray a person, and our family felt it very keenly. Nobody else in the United States caught the blight. Some of us looked upon Zenas's fate as a kind of poetic justice. Well, now that Grandfather knew, so to speak, who was dead, it became increasingly awkward to go on living in the same house with him as if nothing had happened. He would go into towering rages in which he threatened to write to the Board of Health unless the funeral were held at once. We realized that something had to be done. Eventually, we persuaded a friend of Father's named George Martin to dress up in the manner and costume of the 1860s and pretend to be Uncle Zenas in order to set Grandfather's mind at rest. The imposter looked fine and impressive in sideburns and a high beaver hat, and not unlike the daguerreotypes of Zenas in our album. I shall never forget the night, just after dinner, when this Zenas walked into the living room. Grandfather was stomping up and down, tall, hawk-nosed, and round-oathed. The newcomer held out both his hands and cried, "Clem!" Grandfather turned slowly, looked at the intruder, and snorted, "Well, who are you?" "I'm Zenas, your brother Zenas, fit as a fiddle and sound as a dollar." "Zenas, my foot. Zenas died of the chestnut blight in 66. Well, Grandfather was given to these sudden, unexpected, and extremely lucid moments. They were generally more embarrassing than his other moments. He comprehended before he went to bed that night that the old automobile had been destroyed and that its destruction had caused all the turmoil in the house. "It flew all to pieces, Pa," my mother told him in graphically describing the accident. "I knew it would. Always told you to get a Pope Toledo." Well, I'll never forget the night of November 17th, 1915, the night the ghost got in our house and ended up with my grandfather shooting a patrolman. I had just stepped out of the bathtub and was busily rubbing myself with a towel when I heard the steps of a man walking rapidly around the dining room table downstairs. At first, I thought it was a burglar. It didn't enter my mind until later that it was a ghost. However, I went to the back stair door and slammed it shut and held my knee against it. The slamming of the door had aroused Mother, and she peered out of her room and wanted to know what was the matter. When I told her about the steps, she shouted, "Burglars! and fled to the phone to call the police. They were on hand in a commendably short time. A Ford sedan full of them, 2 on motorcycles, and a patrol wagon with about 8 in it, and a few reporters. They caught me standing in my towel at the top of the stairs. A heavy policeman bounded up the steps. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Well, I live here," I said. "Well, what's the matter? You hot?" It was, as a matter of fact, cold, and I went to my room and pulled on some trousers. On my way out, another cop stuck a gun in my ribs and said, "What are you doing here?" I live here," I said. Well, a half-dozen policemen emerged out of the darkness of the front hallway upstairs and began to ransack the floor, pulling beds away from the walls, tore clothes off the hooks in the closets, pulled suitcases and boxes off the shelves. "No sign of nothing," said one cop. He jerked a thumb toward me and said, "This guy was naked. The lady seems hysterical." They all nodded, but said nothing and just looked at me. In the small silence, we all heard a creaking in the attic. Grandfather was sleeping there in the old walnut bed, which, as you will remember, once fell on my father. "What's that?" snapped the cop, and 5 or 6 of them sprang to the attic door before I could intervene or explain. I realized that it would be bad if they burst in on Grandfather unannounced, or even announced. He was going through a phase in which he believed that General Meade's men, under steady hammering by Stonewall Jackson, were beginning to retreat and even desert. When I got to the attic, things were pretty confused. Grandfather had evidently jumped to the conclusion that the police were deserters from Meade's army trying to hide away in his attic. He bounded out of bed, wearing a long flannel nightgown over long woolen underwear, a nightcap, and a leather jacket around his chest. The cops must have realized at once that the indignant white-haired old man belonged in the house, but they had no chance to say so. Grandfather roared, "Back, ye cowardly dogs! Back to the lines, ye lily-livered cattle!" With that, he dealt a flat-handed smack alongside the head of one of the officers that sent him sprawling. The others beat a retreat, but not fast enough. Grandfather grabbed one of the cop's guns from its holster and let fly. The report seemed to crack the rafters. Smoke filled the attic. A cop cursed and shot his hand to his shoulder. Somehow, we all finally got downstairs again and locked the door against Grandfather. He fired once or twice more in the darkness and then went back to bed. A reporter, a thin-faced, wispy man, came up to me and said, "Just what the heck is the real lowdown here, Bud?" And I decided to be frank with him. "Well, we had ghosts," I said. He gazed at me a long time, as if I were a slot machine that didn't pay off. And then he walked away. After they'd gone, Mother asked, "Well, what was the matter with that one policeman?" "Oh, Grandfather shot him," I said. "What for?" I told her that he was a deserter. "Well, of all things, he was such a nice-looking man." Grandfather was fresh as a daisy and full of jokes the next morning. We thought he'd forgotten all about what had happened, but he hadn't. Over his 3rd cup of coffee, he glared at us and said, "What was the idea of all them cops terre-hooting around the house last night?" Well, he had us there.
You've just heard another chapter from My Life and Hard Times by James Thurber, as told by Nelson Olmsted. And our closing word.
Well, tomorrow I'm going to bring you one more chapter from My Life and Hard Times entitled Draft Board Nights. I hope you can be with us to hear it. Daylight saving time ends in some communities this weekend, so check your local radio column for time changes that may affect this and other programs. This is Nelson Olmsted saying goodbye and good reading.
Nelson Olmsted has presented another great short story from the world of literature. This is NBC, the national broadcasting company.